Hello, welcome to Ask an Expert. This time round, we've got Ed Stanford with us from RAGT. And for those of you that don't know me, I'm Andrew Huxham, one of the co-founders of Hectare, but also an arable farmer from southern England. So we're going to be talking about plant breeding, a topic which I believe as a farmer is probably fairly poorly understood. It seems like a bit of the dark art of the industry, but actually something that, as a farmer, has a huge impact on everything I do and grow. So thank you very much, Ed, for joining us today. I think to kick things off, as I said, I think it's generally poorly understood, but maybe we could start with a fairly broad question, and you could just try and explain how do you think seed breeding contributes to profitable arable farming within the UK as we are at the moment?
Yeah, it's a good question. So firstly, obviously, the main thing that contributes to profitable farming is farmers. There's nothing that takes away from that. We are farmers. I am a farmer. So, as much as when I started working with breeding, I didn't understand very much about breeding, I was actually very surprised at how a lot of the people in the breeding industry across the whole industry are actually farmers and from a farming background. But the way that seed really integrates into that, there's three parts. One is that we need to make sure that we can continue. So a big part of seed breeding that people very often overlook is the ability to continue doing the same thing without going backwards. So we see differences in diseases, we see differences in pressures, and the ability to maintain the same yields, even though some farmers might think, well, hang on, why is it not getting better and better and better? Because obviously there's natural capabilities of fields and everything else. But the fact that we're not getting worse is in itself a breeding achievement. And then on top of that, yields, of course, it's a big conversation. Can we keep the yield threshold going up? And that's fine. Ultimately, if you're making a profitable decision on farm, you want to have as much yield as possible to make as much money as possible. We're all in business at the end of the day. But more of the focus these days is on actually how much money am I spending on my crop? And is there a way that breeding can help me have less spend or a more consistent spend? And that's one of the things that we're really looking at, because it's easier to impact as a breeder is by bringing in traits and by making sure that the traits are resilient and different to the rest of the market and to the rest of their own portfolios.
Yeah, that's a great point, Ed, because I think there's a lot of focus in arable farming on yields. And, at the moment, there's huge financial pressures. We could all list them off from BPS and capping SFI, but the escalation of input costs, machinery costs, etc. So when margins are tight, I mean, you touched on it briefly there, but how do you think farmers should think about their seed choice as a driver of profitability and margin? And so what traits do you think have the greatest impact? Because we've alluded to the fact that possibly it's no longer yield. That obviously will have a big impact. But what do you think farmers should be looking at, and what traits are you focusing on at the moment?
So I think there's three main things that farmers focus on anyway. I don't want people to take this as me telling farmers how to farm, because a lot of people, they'll be going, what's he talking about? I know this is what I do. But the main choice really is marketability. When you make the decision to buy a seed, the first thing you need to know is where are you going to sell it? And for some people, that is still very much the person down the end of the road buys my seed. That's the way it's always going to be. But for other people, whether it's distilling, whether it's export, there's loads of different markets. And it could be that milling market doesn't make sense for you, even with a premium. And it might be better to go for something that doesn't have a premium and hit higher yields. There's all sorts of new markets opening up as well, which is very exciting. But ultimately, the marketability is the most important thing. Before you buy it, how are you going to sell it? And can you get it there? The other thing is resilience. I think that's one thing that's certainly been a big topic last year, is if something's a 3 for yellow rust, it really doesn't matter if you can control that yellow rust. But if something says it's a 6 for yellow rust, and in reality it's more of a 3 for yellow rust, that becomes really hard to plan, that becomes really hard to account for, and that makes you stressed at the time when your spray windows are closing. So that resilience, and it's easy for any breeder to turn around and say, oh, our varieties are always resilient, because there's a natural element of disease breakdown. but also you need something that does what it says on the tin. And making a choice for yield is fine if you're sure that you're going to have a certain number of fields that are within your spray window, that are within your spray capabilities by the size of your machinery. But there's also considerations to make about, well, what about that field at the end of the like A road? You know, it takes you half a day to get there. If the spray windows are closing, it's not going to get done, is it? It's more than just one variety for one farm. You know, there's a choice of varieties, there's a choice of end markets, and you need to make sure that the choices you're making match your whole business structure of, this is what we want to do, but what can we physically achieve? And is there varieties out there that perhaps this one isn't the number one yield, but I know if my spray windows get missed, it doesn't matter. And it's those kind of choices that are coming more and more to the forefront. And, you know, you've touched on things that we can't impact. We can't breed for political decision. It's not something that any breeder can do. But things you can breed for. So 2024, a really bad year for brown rust. 2025, a year that saw new changes in yellow rust, but wasn't actually a bad year for yellow rust. 2026 has turned dry now, but it looked like it had all the makings for a bad year of yellow rust. And this isn't me trying to scaremonger or anything, but we need to make sure that if we're constantly seeing the worst year for some time, then we need to make sure that we have varieties that in every year, not just according to some data, but actually in reality on farm, do what they say on the tin. So for farmers, they need varieties they can trust.
Absolutely. And that's really interesting. And you're absolutely right. You know, what is your end market, and is it going to be demanded by the processors at the end of the day, the people that are going to be using it? I think that's absolutely critical. So what makes breeding crops specifically for UK conditions different from elsewhere? And do you see a shift in trait priorities in response to our climate variability? Because as a farmer, it feels like often the winters are getting wetter, probably warmer. Summers are invariably getting drier, actually. You know, we could all do with a bit of rain now, but this time last year it hadn't rained for about 6 weeks on the south coast, so we're actually not doing too badly. But it does feel like the climate's changing. So, do you see a shift in trait priorities in response to these changes, or is it mainly disease focused?
So it's probably worth talking from a breeding perspective in general. Is that a lot of the breeders that are in the marketplace at the minute, they are international breeders, and that is done for strategy reasons, because if the number one crop in France is, say, maize, and the number one crop in the UK is not maize, then it's going to be hard to make a significant investment into maize. But when you're a company that has wheat breeding in the UK and spring barley breeding in the UK that's supplying out to the world, and then you have maize breeding in France, suddenly it then becomes easier and you have a better genetic pool to bring those maize varieties in. And in maize, as an example, you know, we're seeing now that there's FAOs in maize that are making it more able to be grown by farmers in much more regions than where it has been for the last sort of 10 years. And the same thing with wheat. You know, wheat is one of those crops that doesn't travel particularly well. The wheat that we grow for the UK can typically travel to Denmark. They have sort of similar climate. But even within the UK, you know, we have the west wind that brings rain across Ireland and Wales, the southwest. We've got bigger amounts of daylight, but yet colder weather in Scotland. We've got dry weather in the east that sometimes doesn't get any rain, but the village next to it gets all of the rain. You know, there's lots of different climatic conditions, and being a maritime climate in the UK is a very unique place to breed for. And from a breeding perspective, it's very nice to have as a breeding target above from a farmer level. It helps the farmer at the end of the day, but from a breeding target, it's nice to have a variety that travels, because if you take your Planet spring barley, your Laureate spring barley, the end market that turns that into a product, they like to have the same recipe in each different country. So they like to buy and put contracts out with the same varieties in as many places as possible. And it's not always possible agronomically. And that helps farmers, because then you have a variety that's got lots of demand, because if suddenly Scotland has reached its demand for spring barley, there's an export market because it's on contract in other places. So as nice as it is to have varieties that travel, it's not always the easiest thing to achieve. And especially in the UK, because we're a maritime climate, we're quite a small island compared to a lot of other continents. And it's one of those things where to breed a good variety for the UK takes a big trials network. You know, there's lots of trials, both breeder trials and recommended list trials, official trials, all across the country. And breeding is, you know, sort of thing that get told off by the breeder for saying, but breeding is 50% breeding and it's 50% trials in layman's terms. You put all of your effort into breeding and bringing genetics to the market, but ultimately you have to have a trials network to say, how does this perform in South Wales versus North Norfolk? How does this provide grain in Scotland every year? It can't just be that in the first year we tried it, it did very well, because it could be that that was a dry year. So this happened.
So the importance from your perspective, from a breeder's perspective, of the national coverage of trials is really about the differences in the weather around the UK and how that performs in the same year or over different years, is what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly. So we have varieties that over 10-year breeding cycle will have 2 years in the official system. And for each year that they exist, they get more and more seed physically available to send to more trials. So over 10 years, we know that, well, we don't have any dry data for this year, but we can go back 3 years to the dry year and see how it performed, like anywhere that that trial was located. And it's the same when it comes to varieties internationally. For other species, it's very good to have varieties that you can bring in that match. So something that might be a very early variety in France might be the latest variety we could have in the UK. But from a species perspective, that's really helpful. But from the species that we tend to grow in the UK, it tends to be more that they're bred in the UK for the UK. So it's good to have a balance of both. It's good to have plants that travel because you have more marketability at the end of the day when they survive in different countries. But the UK is such a specific market that we need to be breeding for the UK. And it is worth saying that all breeders, when they breed species on the continent or in other parts of the world for the UK, that is majority bred for the UK. It won't very often be the same variety of maize or oilseed rape that you see in France. Sometimes it will be because it travels well and you have the same seed multiplication. And other times it will be a variety that is perhaps too early for France, but for us is just where we need it to be. So there's a real mix of, it's not that these varieties are just, you know, things that are left over at the end and they go, oh, the UK can have that. It's we have breeders in France that come over to the UK. They visit trial sites, they visit breeding stations, and, you know, it takes a lot of work to get some of these varieties, you know, made. Predominantly cereals is what we focus on in the UK, but to be able to supply farmers with alternative break crops, to provide them with other species as well, it does take a lot of work. And
so it's intentionally specific from a geographical perspective to get the varieties in the right place.
Yes.
And not all thrive everywhere.
Yes. Yeah.
I think certainly for over the last 5 years, and possibly longer in certain cases, there's been a lot of focus in the UK on regenerative agriculture and reducing inputs. I mean, this probably really kicked off the input side of it following the Ukraine war, which was, you know, over 4 years ago now. When fertilizer prices went through the roof. But actually before then, there was always interest in carbon data of raw commodities. And I think we're going to see that increase. Do you see more demand for varieties suited to lower inputs or regenerative style systems? And how can breeding adapt to reduce nitrogen inputs under the sort of financial and environmental policy pressures we're all seeing increasing in the UK?
Yeah, so it's definitely something that we're seeing a massive uptake in interest, and that's actual interest in terms of seed delivered to farm, as well as interest in terms of people just generally being interested and inquiring into that kind of thing. We've been breeding for a long time in the UK, varieties that try and suit the organic market, which is, a lot more constraint, but is something that's always come with typically a yield penalty in return for being quite resilient. It's like a human. If you want someone that's going to be very good at sprinting to the finish line, they're probably not going to be a very good marathon runner. And there's only a certain amount of genetic that you can really put into something. So normally a yield penalty comes, and by the time you breed up to a standard that the market expects, it takes a long time. It's hard to make things happen overnight. But with the regenerative system or the low input system, we're seeing a lot of farmers, some that don't brand themselves as regenerative, just trying to make better business decisions. They want to make less inputs because they don't want to be so reliant on prices and the price of inputs. And what we find is that having varieties that are yielding well and having a higher level of resistance and a higher level of traits works really well, because they're not expecting a variety that meets certain specifications. They just want a variety that will practically help them deliver with less input or will be more resilient, like I was saying before about spray windows. So if you have a variety that is a 9 for yellow rust, a 9 for brown rust, a 6.9 for septoria, has a couple of traits around, BYDV and orange blossom midge, you're not going to say to a farmer, oh, you shouldn't be using insecticides, you shouldn't be using nitrogen, you shouldn't be using chemistry, because from a breeding perspective, it's not the industry's position to take, but it gives the farmer the option that if they can't spray an insecticide, they're not likely to see as bad a problem. It gives the farmer the ability to not worry so much about spray windows. There's a lot of farmers out there, I've got a lot of respect for all farmers, but there are farmers out there that have big farms and they can travel for quite a long time before crossing a road. And then there are farmers out there that have to do quite a lot of traveling between each field. All farmers are different. And for some farmers, logistics play a big part. For contractors as well, where are they going to put the seed that's awkward to get to when it comes to timings? And then from fertilizer point of view, we've been looking at nitrogen curves for a long time. As an industry, we've been trying to find ways to make it that plants are as efficient as possible, but it is really tricky because ultimately the market standard for yield for a feed wheat as well as for a milling wheat is at a level where if you say in this variety it's more profitable, but you're going to make so much less money than you are by having the high input situation that no one in their right mind would do it, it doesn't stack up as a business decision. So we're getting there with breeding to try and find it. And one thing that we are certainly doing, which isn't from a breeding point of view, from a trials point of view, we're trying to create data packages as an industry that show, this is what happens when you grow this variety with slightly less nitrogen, so that farmers know that on certain varieties, don't try it. You have to put the nitrogen in to get the result back. But then in other varieties, there's that information there that says on these varieties, you can cut back by 20 kilos and still hit the same thing. Or as long as you put sulfur on, don't worry so much about how much nitrogen you put on at this point. And from an industry point of view, we're constantly getting more end markets talking about scope 3 emissions, which for anyone that doesn't know, that's the emissions that go into creating the inputs. So if you're creating a bottle of whiskey, then your factory is your emissions, but your scope 3 emissions are what the farmer is doing to the spring barley that ends up becoming that whiskey. So from that perspective as well, we're doing a lot of trials work. And one thing I will say in favour of the end markets is they are very keen to be more environmentally sustainable, but they are very realistic. They're not expecting farmers or breeders or anyone to suddenly change historic methods that work and then fail to supply because it doesn't stack up. They are working with people to try and find a way forward. And from a farmer perspective, because I am a farmer at the end of the day, if that stacks up with a premium, happy days, because ultimately it's got to pay and it's got to make sense.
Yeah, and it's I think that's a really interesting point you make about all farms being different in terms of not only what's their capability in terms of work capacity, so timings of spray applications or fertilizer, but also soil types, and I think more importantly, attitude to risk as well. Each individual farm business probably has a slightly different attitude to risk in terms of, what it's prepared to try. And I suppose having as much information as possible from these trials, not just about what's their septoria rating, but how does this variety perform if you use 25% less nitrogen or sulfur? That's really important, isn't it, in terms of making an informed decision. Building up that knowledge base is superb. Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. I suppose it'd be good to look a bit further forward as well. And I'd like to ask, what do you feel are the biggest challenges facing UK seed breeders, and what traits do you think will define the most successful varieties? Let's take wheat, for example, in that over the next 10 to 15 years would be a nice one to finish on if you could try and answer that difficult question.
Well, it is a difficult question, but for me, it's a slightly political answer at the start. So, I'm from a farming background. My family have always been in farming, and for me, the biggest challenge that breeding is facing even now is the same challenges farmers are facing. Because at the end of the day, farmers need to make money to be a business, and farmers need to have end markets. And I'm not talking about how any one specific end market is paying. I'm talking about the perception of food by the consumer, the perception of food importance by the policymakers. Every step of agriculture needs to stand up and be viable as a business. So for breeding to be successful, the primary function of that is for farmers to be successful. That's what we want. That's what we represent. And, we try our best with supporting with varieties, but one example of a challenge that breeders face, and this is all breeders, this isn't any one particular breeder, but if I say to you about SFI, and I said to you, okay, it takes 2 years to produce clover seed, so how much clover seed am I going to need for SFI in 2032? You'd turn around and say, well, I don't know if there's going to be an SFI in 2032. And so there's those kind of challenges for breeders. It's how do you plan production? How do you plan what the future is going to be like in the short term? But from a wheat breeding perspective, it's very much a longer term picture. That for the most part, this is a wheat breeding nation. That's what we're going to continue to do. We need it to stack up profitably, but ultimately that is what we're good at doing. We're very efficient at doing it. The same with spring barley. So from a cereals perspective, we're very good cereals growers. But one of the things that I would say is, it's kind of like the British clothing industry. So the British clothing industry is now a luxury, whereas one point it was a standard. And, I don't want farming to go that way. I want farming to be seen as something that's vital for the security. I don't want it to be something that's seen as, oh, well, we can import it. It's like, yeah, you can, until you get to a point where you rely on the imports. So we really need to make sure that the entire industries are working together. And this is one thing I want people to really take away, is that it's not the breeders supporting farmers. It's that a majority of the staff at breeding companies are farmers. They're from farming backgrounds. We're all, in our minds, we are all the same. And we don't work as breeders without farmers working as farmers. And from a trait perspective, I think, septoria is obviously important because it's important on farm. Yellow rust, brown rust, they're all very important. And as these strains change and overcome resistances, we have to make sure that we're constantly breeding to continue doing what we're doing. We also need to make sure that new traits are coming forward. Blossom midge was a new trait and now is very much a standard in most things that come through. BYDV resistance will probably end up being the same thing in the distant future. It's certainly a good thing to have as a new trait to the market. And it's one of those things where, the timing of BYDV resistance, give or take 18 months, coincided with the banning of some chemistry. And I think a lot of farmers thought, oh, how long have they been sitting on that? But in reality, the majority of times when these things happen, we don't have a trait sat in the wings. It was just coincidental timing that came through at that point. And it's taken until now, being completely truthful, for the varieties that carry BYDV resistance to start matching what's expected from the yields. So I don't want to see a future where chemicals are banned. It'd be ideal to see a future where chemistry is in the hands of farmers to decide what they need or don't need. But if we end up in a future that's like that, we need to be making sure that we're breeding as much as we can to have the varieties as strong as possible with as many traits as possible, so that when they come to the market, we have varieties that are strong. And, you know, I don't know what's going to happen in the world of chemistry, and I don't know what's going to happen in the world of diseases changing, but we need to make sure that we have different resistances and new traits that mean we can keep doing what we're doing because we're pretty good at it. And, you know, we want to be able to continue doing it and hopefully to continue making money off of it. Because ultimately, farmers, although we call them farmers, you know, we're all actually business people, and we all need to make a margin at the end of the day to put food on the table, if you pardon the pun.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you very much, Ed. That was really, really insightful. I've certainly learned a lot myself as a farmer sat here listening to you, and I think you've probably given me a bit of confidence in the amount of work and what lies ahead of us, and the people and the businesses behind it all that are going to keep focusing on trying to provide us with robust and resilient varieties going forward. So that's great to hear. Thank you very much.
That's all right. Thank you.
Good to join us. Thanks, Ed.
Yeah, thank you for your time.